Hello, and welcome to Storytelling Animals, a green new podcast of climate, ecology, and animal justice. I'm your host, Dayton Martindale, and today my guest is Hannah Seo. She is an environmental journalist and the author of two recent short pieces for The Guardian in their new series, Extinction Obituaries. So basically, The Guardian has started running a bunch of obituary type pieces for species that have semi-recently gone extinct. And Hannah wrote two of the first three in the series, covering two creatures, the Christmas Island forest skink and the Bramble Cay melomys. So I know in a lot of episodes of this podcast, we talk with book authors and, cover a wide range of ground, kind of often from a, 100-foot view. This was kind of a nice chance to zoom in on two particular animals, what negative pressures they faced, how they went extinct, and, what that was like for the scientists and others who watched them go extinct and raised the warning, and, didn't see any good come of it. I wanted to do a quick update on the Storytelling Animals book club. Thank you to everyone who came out for our discussion of N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season, a fantasy novel with some climate themes. That was a week ago last Tuesday, and that was our biggest turnout yet for the book club. If you're interested in joining, our next couple meetings are Tuesday, June 28th, to discuss Entangled Life, How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures by Merlin Sheldrake. After that is July 26th, also a Tuesday, to discuss The Ministry for the Future by past podcast guest Kim Stanley Robinson. That's a novel about kind of a vision of how over the next few decades humanity might confront climate change. And then another nonfiction book on Tuesday, August 23rd, As Long as Grass Grows, the Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. And that's by Dina Giglio Whitaker. If you're interested in joining that book club, there's more information on my website. That's daytonmartindale.com/book-club. I'll also put that link in the episode description. Basically, the short version is you can get a free trial of the book club by joining my free weekly newsletter, or you can join permanently by supporting the podcast on Patreon at the $7 a month or higher tier. A quick note on that Patreon. I got an email recently from a publisher asking if I'd be interested in interviewing one of their authors. And she said to you and your team at Storytelling Animals. And there's not really a team. My brother, Kyle Martindale, made the logo, which I'm extremely grateful for. I love the design. But other than that, the team is you, the people who listen, the people who subscribe to the newsletter, and in particular, the people who support this podcast on Patreon by giving just a few bucks a month to basically allow me to justify continuing to do this and put a lot of my time into it. So if you would be willing to also chip in a few bucks a month at my Patreon page, patreon.com/storytellingpod, I'd be really grateful. And it would allow me again to really think about doing this podcast long term, investing more into it, getting, better software and such. You also get some perks too. You get early access to episodes, and like I said, at certain tiers, you can get book club membership, and also a new perk announced for the first time. Well, it was in my newsletter last week, but announced publicly for the first time right now. You can ask me anything, and I'll do a future episode where I answer your questions, and those questions could be, oh, I liked your interview with Kim Stanley Robinson, like what books by him should I read? And that is a question that someone has asked me. Or it can be, about climate change. It can be, a scientific question you have. It can be, a question for me, like how did you start getting interested in climate change, or why did you go vegan, or something like that. or it can be like a more policy question about, an environmental issue or whatever. So yeah, Patreon supporters can submit questions to me, and I will answer those questions in a future episode, and hopefully that will be great. So yeah, but today I'm not answering your questions. I'm asking the questions, and I'm asking the questions for Guardian or for environmental journalist Hannah Seo about her articles for The Guardian. Without further ado, here's the interview. Hi, I'm here with Hannah Seo. Hannah, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so what I want to talk about today is this new series at The Guardian, which is called Extinction Obituaries, which are obituaries of recently extinct animal species. And you wrote 2 of the first 3 obituaries in this series. So I wanted to check in just kind of how you got involved in this project and kind of what your interest was in extinct species.
So I've done a lot of reporting previously on ecology and specifically about, how human-caused climate change kind of impacts the ecology of different habitats. And actually an editor at The Guardian, Alistair G., he reached out to me and, pointed at my previous reporting and asked if I was interested in writing these obituaries for him. I think their main impetus was that, obviously these species have been written about before, but what they really wanted was to kind of take the obituary style, where the writing is kind of elegiac and a little bit lyrical, and have that sort of writing style implemented for, just to kind of honor these species that have kind of been sacrificed to the changing world and the changing climate. And I was really intrigued by that idea, bringing sort of lyrical prose to science reporting. And so I was super eager to just hop on.
You've also written some poetry, is that correct?
Yes, I am a poet on the side. I don't often volunteer that because sometimes it sounds kind of embarrassing. But yes, I have published over 20 poems at this point, yes.
I just bring it up because it may be helpful in that elegiac style of obituary. So the 2 species that you wrote about are the Christmas Island forest skink and the Bramble Cay melomys. Maybe let's take them one at a time. First, what even is a skink? I'm not sure everyone knows.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really know what a skink was until I started researching for this obituary. But a skink is just a type of reptile. It's a type of lizard. It really kind of looks like, if you Google what a skink is, it really looks like the classic generic image of what a lizard would be. It's just kind of has like a low, flat, skinny body, long tail, and a Christmas Island forest skink specifically is pretty undescript. It's pretty nondescript. It's pretty plain looking. It's just kind of brown with a slight yellowish hues in its scales, and it's reportedly was a very muted, gentle creature that really had no super charismatic behavior. Just kind of laid around in the sun, did its thing, just hung out, and that was its whole life. And it's just like a little lizard.
And it's the Christmas Island forest skink. For the geographically challenged among us, where is Christmas Island?
Yeah, so Christmas Island is technically an Australian territory, but it is kind of located just south of Indonesia. So it's kind of like if the northwestern tip of Australia, between that area of Australia and Indonesia is kind of where Christmas Island is, and it's a relatively pretty small island.
So one of the things that is striking and alarming about both of the obituaries is that the declines in population for the skink and the melomys were relatively rapid. A few decades ago, you might have looked and seen a bunch of skinks and thought they were doing fine. So how recently did the skinks begin to really decline? And what is our best guess of what was causing that?
Yeah, so for both of the species, the Christmas Island forest skinks and the Bramble Cay melomyses, they were pretty abundant until about like the latter half of the 20th century. So the decline in the skinks were really observed starting in like the 70s, 80s, and then by the 90s they were still abundant, but still winnowing for sure. It was definitely noticeable that their population numbers were going down. And then by the early 2000s, there were only a few that they could really find. And then by the time that they tried to create a captive breeding program, they could really only find three and capture three. And with the melomyses, the decline really happened in like around the same time, like early 2000s. Only about a dozen melomyses could be found. And then when they tried to capture them, and once they had created an initiative to create a captive breeding program, by that time in 2009, 10, 11, they couldn't even find a single one. And so these things happened super quickly. And I think that the interesting pattern that you can observe with both of these is that both the melomys and a melomys is a rodent. It's about like the size of the palm of, I guess you could hold it in two hands. It's a little bit bigger than just single hand size. It's kind of 6 inches in body, and then there has like a kind of a long tail. But both those melomyses and the forest skinks, they were such gentle, unassuming creatures. They really had no strong, forceful, predatory forces that were challenging them in a survival pressure way. So they kind of had an easy life. They lived in these isolated island habitats. They had very few concerns besides just like going about their day and gently like chewing on their vegetative diets, hanging out with each other. And because they had not adapted to any strong, forceful survival pressures on any side, anything that disrupts their environment is going to really harshly impact them and their behavior and their ability to survive, because they're just used to having very gentle circumstances, right? It's like when your lives are cushioned with such ease, and when things have not been changing for thousands and thousands of years on your island, they were, I don't want to say that they were complacent, but there was no reason to be vigilant or to develop any sort of harsh survival instincts. And so when things like climate change occur or when habitat disruption occur, those really impacted their numbers severely.
Mm-hmm. So on Christmas Island, what did begin to change?
Yeah, so when researchers and, when people first went to Christmas Island, a lot of it is habitat disruption. So the Christmas Island still to this day has quite a bit of forest area, but there was some clearing so that people could build research facilities or just like different facilities for humans to kind of live and for humans to kind of exist there. There's not a huge population that lives there full time. Like I think at any given time there's maybe like a dozen researchers and some custodians and whatever. But it was really habitat disruption and also the introduction of invasive species. So the forest skinks had basically no natural predators on their island for a while, but then when other humans came, to the island to do research or to explore, they brought with them things like snakes, different birds, and those predators and invasive species like ants and different insects also were invaded Christmas Island. And the introduction of all of these species really impacted the skinks, whether it's because they competed with the skinks for food or whether they preyed on the skinks directly. All of these pressures kind of added up, and because they had evolved to, not endure any of those hardships, the population really dwindled.
Mm-hmm. And you say in the article there was also phosphate mining, which I believe is used in fertilizer.
Yes, phosphate mining again adds to the disruption. Some tree clearing, some land disruption, and pre all of this disruption, the forest skinks were kind of found all over the island. But then with this disruption, I think the initial thoughts were that the forest skinks would be fine because there are other parts of the island that they can kind of live in and survive in. But all of this kind of created an imbalance, and the skinks just couldn't withstand it.
Mm-hmm. And I want to get back to the melomys as well. First, again, where is Bramble Cay, or even what is Bramble Cay?
Yeah, so a cay is any low-lying sandy island that's pretty small and by a reef. And so Bramble Cay is a very small, low-lying sandy island that kind of exists at the northern tip of the Great Barrier Reef. So this is kind of partway between northern Australia and Papua New Guinea.
Okay, and you have this little rodent, the melomys, and I think one of the, how I first heard about the melomys a few years ago, it was in the news as one of the first, if not the first, mammals to go extinct where we know that climate change was a major cause. So how did climate change play a role in the extinction of the Bramble Cay melomys?
Yeah, it's a good question because I feel like, especially scientists of all people, they're kind of reticent to label something definitively as like this caused this. But I think there's general consensus that the Bramble Cay melomys did go extinct because of human-caused climate change, and that's because the melomys lived on this low-lying island, and they were there for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, and they survived for that long in spite of, different weather patterns and different climate changes throughout those eras. But the rapid decline that happened in between like the early 20th century and the early 2000s was because of sea level change, and also and sea level change as a consequence of human-caused climate change. And so what happened is that originally Bramble Cay was covered in vegetation, and there were some insects, and the melomys was basically like the only mammal on the island. But what happened is that as climate change worsened, there was an increase in storm surges, so big storms that would kind of sweep over the cay and kind of wash creatures off the island. So storm surges would come and sweep, basically just like flush some of the rodents off of the island, and then they would die because they are not particularly great swimmers. And as the sea level changed as well, slowly that their little island was kind of encroached upon. And not only is the sea level change kind of detrimental because of, this kind of encroachment on the land, but also it's a concern for the plants, right? There's saltwater intrusion where the soil, or I don't know if soil is the right word because it's a really sandy cay, but all of the vegetation that lives on the sandy cay can't withstand so much salt. And so as the salt water kind of intrudes onto the land, a lot of the vegetation kind of ends up choking up and dying. And without that vegetation, the melomys had a hard time feeding, and then just combine both those factors, just less food, and also these waves are washing them out to sea, and they just couldn't withstand all of those pressures.
Mm-hmm. So we have here a lizard and a rodent who have gone extinct in the last few years. The first entry in the series was the Po'ouli, which is a tropical bird in Hawaii. I think it's notable that especially your two entries, a lizard and a rodent, aren't necessarily the most glamorous species. They aren't the rhino or the panda or the some of the animals that get the most attention for conservation issues. And obviously those larger animals deserve attention for conservation issues. But why do you think it's important to to write about a lizard and a rodent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a question that I also posed to the researchers I talked to who had worked on these conservation efforts. And, the bottom line answer is just that preserving diversity means preserving all diversity, right? No matter whether these animals are cute or cool or interesting or not. This forest skink looks fairly plain, but it had a long-standing role in the ecology of Christmas Island. The melomyses, those melomyses that lived on Bramble Cay, they are an isolated species. They were an isolated species, past tense. They were an isolated species that lived purely only on this tiny little cay. And that's, even though these melomyces, these rodents, were so kind of plain, and maybe they might, I don't know, they might gross some people out because they are rodents and they look kind of rat-like, but they were this unique species that lived on this very isolated island, and that in and of itself should be worth preserving. And the sad part is that it is true that a lot of conservation efforts and a lot of conservation noise and funding goes towards creatures who are charismatic and iconic and just cool. Think of the giant pandas or elephants or whales. People love to talk about and think about these huge species because they are magnificent and awe-inspiring. But these tiny little species that exist in isolated pockets are also struggling and are arguably more vulnerable because they live in such delicate balances in the ecology where they are. And so preserving species like this, preserving species that do go unnoticed, is valuable in and of itself because preserving diversity means preserving all diversity.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think it's also not a coincidence that a lot of these are island species, species that are the ones who have gone extinct already because there's not as much, A, they're not used to outsiders in the same way that a mainland species might be, and B, there's nowhere to go when the seas come rising, or when the ecosystem starts changing.
Exactly. Yeah, islands are such fascinating places to go to when you want to look at diversity and in ecology. But yeah, like you said, the double edge to that is that you have very limited space and you have nowhere to go, and it's very isolated, and so you just find yourself kind of cornered.
Mm-hmm. So one thing we know about the last skink is that we know who it was. They had identified a specific, I guess I should say, the last Christmas Island forest skink. His name was Gump. Scientists had interacted with him. And one of the scientists you quote, John Wojnarski, who's a conservation biologist, he says in the obituary, "You're looking at that last individual, knowing that when the individual will die, as it inevitably would, that it would be the end of that long evolutionary history. It's a scar on our conscience." And so I guess I sort of have two questions coming off this. The first is just what was it like to talk to all these scientists, and maybe this applies to the other environmental reporting you've done in your career, but especially with this project of talking with scientists who worked with species who are no longer here. What was their emotional attitude toward the issue, or did they keep it relatively scientific, or just what insight did you have into them?
I think all around there's definitely a feeling of frustration and also just a general discontentedness with how a lot of these cases are handled, because I think that in both of these cases, with the skink and with the melomys, there were people documenting the decline of these species and telling policymakers and telling governments and organizations that we need to do something about this now. But the thing is that policy kind of moves slowly. Science moves slowly, but policy also moves slowly. And when the two are working together to try to save a species in a timely manner, these two slow processes can kind of get in each other's way. And so policymakers would be like, oh, well, what's the evidence, and what are the plans, and what can we, and what do you propose? And then the scientists had to go back and document whatever data that they could, and then come back to the policymakers and say, here's what we have. Will you please let us start this captive breeding program? And then that policy making decision then had to go through all of their various regulatory phases, or debates and cycles and circles of reports and just trying to come to formulate a game plan, basically. And all of this is time consuming. And so I think the frustration is that when these processes take such a long time, it's the thing that you lose out on. The loser in this whole situation is the species that you're trying to save. And especially with the Bramble Cay melomyses, there were so many opportunities where they felt like they could have been saved, like really for both the skinks and the melomyses. I think the consensus is that they could have been saved. There could have been captive breeding programs put in place, but things just didn't happen fast enough. And it comes down to political will, but also attention. Like we previously mentioned about how charismatic species kind of get the most attention. If people were willing to make more noise and be more proactive to fight for these lesser known species, there would possibly be more political will, and therefore a faster timeline to get these strategies on track to save these species before it's too late. And a lot of citizen scientists and a lot of community members, especially for the Bramble Cay melomyses, where the melomyses were had like Aboriginal importance, and for Torres Strait Islanders, there are people who do care, but getting that and translating that into action that requires funding and like government approval, like all of that is just so laborious. And I think that the general sense among scientists was that it's a shame and it's frustrating and it's something that can be changed.
Mm-hmm. And I think in some of the tone of your answer, you maybe already answered this, but my follow-up was going to be, if the scientists are feeling frustrated and that it's a shame, what was your experience of reporting it, and how did you feel being the one to write this obituary of a species that'll never be around again?
Yeah, it is quite saddening for sure. And I a lot of the questions, a lot of the times when I report things like this, I'll ask them whether or not they've been to the place or whether they've actually encountered the species that they worked with. And Natalie Waller, who I interviewed for the Bramble Cay melomys obituary, she said that she had been to Bramble Cay, but she never got to see a live melomys. And John Warnarski, he managed to see some skinks, and he made it out to Christmas Island, and so he was able to kind of give me some firsthand accounts. But just in reporting and talking to these scientists, it's interesting because literally this is the time when we go from this binary state, whether or not the species exists or whether the species does not exist. And just talking the contrast between John Warnarski, who managed to encounter a live forest skink, versus Natalie Waller, who never got to see a live Bramble Cay melomys, that and you can see the loss just in talking to those two scientists and just seeing the difference in how one remembers the animal and it's no longer here, and one is lamenting because she never got to see the animal that she studied. And that was just, I don't know, it's just really regretful and really saddening.
Mm-hmm. Just two more questions for you. Mm-hmm. First, I think, so first you mentioned that, there were people who were citizen scientists and others who were fighting for the melomys and the skink while they were alive. And I think for people today who do want to, fight for endangered species or how do we find out about what animals are threatened before they're, some people are probably finding out about the forest skink and the Bramble Cay melomys for the first time today after they're already gone. And how could people find out about this maybe before it's too late, and sort of what, I mean, I know as a journalist, and I'm a journalist too, like we don't always have a complete answer of this, but just from your experience reporting on these issues, like where would you point people who want to kind of get in on the side of an issue where you're helping an animal before it goes extinct?
That's an interesting question, and I'm not sure that I have a great answer for that. I think it's also tricky because, I'm not going to say that, look up the list of the most vulnerable species and go there and help. That's not what that's not necessarily going to be a productive action. But I guess maybe the most useful thing is to be mindful, I guess, about things that you participate in. And what I mean by that is that if you look up your area of where you live and you see that maybe like a certain type of tree is endangered, like there are ways to get involved locally, but I guess it's all contingent upon what is happening in your neighborhood and in your area. But if for example there's some if you discover that there's some controversy with a certain type of tree in a park that's near you, then what you can do is, your level of engagement can be up to you, but what you can possibly get involved with local organizations. Also, there are advocacy groups everywhere for different species, and whether that's flora or fauna, and helping can come in the form of like fundraising. It can come in the form of like going on trips to maybe document where species exist. But I don't know if I have any other specific advice beyond that.
No, I think I think that's an excellent place to start. I don't know if for such a big issue like this, there is a super specific way to tell everyone what to do. I think that's very helpful. And then lastly, one of the things that John Wynarski said is all of these species have a right to exist. And I think that is, that's a sentiment that's been expressed by past guests on this podcast, that I think is shared at least semi-widely through parts of the environmental movement. And earlier you sort of talked about why it's worth writing obituaries of these species, but I'm just curious, not just in your personal, like in your personal view, not talking about what other people should think or writing a philosophy paper or something, but just personally, like what makes you care about the decline of these species?
It's interesting because throughout history, extinctions have always happened naturally. But the thing is that in our current age, we're seeing extinctions happening at a rate that is far beyond what would ever happen in a naturally occurring global ecosystem. Had humans not, decimated the climate in the way that we are and have been. And so I think that's really that's the reason to care and to notice and to pay attention, is because when you see the data of the species that are declining now, I think it's impossible to not care, because if we are the causes of the extinctions of so many species, the logical next answer is, so what can we do about it? And the first thing that we can start to do about this is pay attention. And writing about this and researching it and putting things like this out into the world is part of that first step. Is just like how do we get more people to just pay attention? You can't force people to care, but if you can get the information to their eyes and try to bring it into their purview in the easiest way possible, in the gentlest way possible, that's a good first step.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for helping bring this to the attention of the rest of us. And is there anything else you'd like to add?
Just that, extinctions don't happen, even though both of these species declined super quickly, it was by no means overnight. Like, when we say this happened super quickly, this is on the order of decades. And so when we pay attention to species decline, we have time. We have the ability to do things. It's just a matter of gathering that political will and gathering that social will as well. So yeah, there's time to intervene.
Cool. Well, that's a good note to end on. And Hannah Seo, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
That was Hannah Seo, the author of 2 recent obituaries in The Guardian for extinct species, the Christmas Island forest skink, and the Bramble Cay melomys. For more on that last question about why we should even care about species loss, I recommend scrolling all the way down on your podcast app to my very first episode, an interview with the wildlife journalist Emma Maris that touches on some of those issues. If you enjoy this episode, I would appreciate any help in spreading the word, whether that's sharing on social media or sending to a friend. And if you're still listening, I'd like to invite you again to sign up for my free weekly newsletter, where you'll get new episodes of the podcast and updates on the podcast and book club, as well as a link to the best article I read each week. And also, if you're still listening, I'd like to invite you again to support this podcast on Patreon, which is a monthly monetary support, and the only way currently this podcast makes any money. And that will give you early access to episodes, the ability to ask me questions about climate or animal issues or books or anything else. And then depending on what level of support you commit to, there might be other perks as well, including membership in the Storytelling Animals Book Club. My next episode was with David M. Pena Guzman about his new book, When Animals Dream, The Hidden World of Animal Consciousness. I've already done the interview. It was a lot of fun and a lot of fascinating subjects. So if you support the podcast on Patreon with your early access, you should get access to that episode within a day or two. And then if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll get it emailed to you next Tuesday, which is when it comes out publicly. So everyone else, you can find it next Tuesday or follow the podcast on social media, or follow me on social media or follow the podcast on your listening app to get an update next Tuesday as well. That's all for now, and thanks for listening.